The Thompson family had always been the picture of perfection. Jack and Carolyn Thompson had it all: wealth, status, a beautiful home, and two children they adored. Their lives seemed so perfect that the neighbors often envied them. Their children, Emma and Tyler, were well-mannered, bright, and successful in school. The Thompsons were the family everyone admired. To everyone, the Thompsons were an ideal family. But even the most perfect picture can have hidden cracks, and for Caroline, those cracks began to show on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Caroline had spent the morning cleaning out her late father's belongings, a task she had put off for far too long. After his passing, she had kept his things exactly as he left them: his favorite chair, his old books, even the pictures on the wall. But now, with so much time past, Caroline knew it was time to go through everything. She was cleaning out his study when she came across a box tucked away in the corner, buried under stacks of papers. It was an old, dusty cardboard box. Curiosity tugged at her, and she decided to open it. Inside were dozens of old photo albums, letters, and trinkets, reminders of a past that had slowly faded from memory. Carolyn smiled as she flipped through the pages of the photo albums, seeing her younger self, her family, and the time she had shared with her father. But then, one photo caught her eye. It was a picture of her father smiling broadly as he stood next to a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and a warm, inviting smile. They stood close together, their arms around each other. The photo had been taken on a beach, and the happiness radiating from the image made Caroline pause. Who was this woman? The back of the photo had a name written in her father's handwriting: Sarah. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. Sarah? She had never heard that name before. She had always thought she knew everything about her father. They were close, or at least she thought they were. Why had he never mentioned Sarah to her? Caroline's mind was racing. Was this another woman? Was she someone from my father's past? Her fingers trembled as she put the photo down and looked through the rest of the box, hoping for an explanation. But there was nothing. No letter, no note, just more photos of Sarah, and sometimes with her father. Caroline's heart was pounding now. The photo wasn't the only thing that seemed out of place. There were multiple pictures of Sarah scattered around the box, but not a single one of her mother. Caroline's mother had passed years ago, and her father had always been the pillar of support after her passing. Why had he hidden this from her? After hours of searching, Caroline was exhausted, but she knew she couldn't leave it there. She needed to know the truth. The next evening, after dinner, Caroline sat down with Jack, her husband. She had been quiet all day, and Jack noticed the shift in her mood. She could never keep things from him, not even the smallest detail. Jack, she started, her voice unsteady, I need to tell you something. It's about my father. Jack looked up from his plate, sensing the seriousness in her tone. What happened, Caroline? He asked. I found something today, she said softly. I found a picture, Jack, of my father and a woman named Sarah. I don't know who she is. I've never heard him mention her before. Caroline's voice cracked as she spoke. Jack frowned. Sarah? What do you mean? Who is she? He asked, leaning forward. I don't know, Jack. There was no mention of her in any of his letters, no hint of who she was, Caroline replied, her voice trembling. And I feel like my whole life, my whole relationship with him, it's built on things I didn't know. Jack's expression softened, and he reached across the table to hold her hand. This is a lot to process, Caroline, but we'll figure this out together. That night, Caroline couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. Who was Sarah? What did she mean to my father? Caroline's gut told her that this wasn't just a forgotten chapter of his life. It was something far more important. The secret felt like a weight, heavy on her heart, and she knew she had to find answers. The next morning, Caroline decided to go through her father's old documents again. She couldn't just leave it at the photo. As she went through his papers, one in particular caught her eye. An old envelope addressed to her father in an elegant script. It was postmarked many years ago, back before her mother had passed. She opened it cautiously, hoping it would bring some clarity. Inside was a letter from a lawyer. The letter was about an estate, but the details weren't what Caroline was expecting. The letter referenced a family trust and a son who was not Caroline. She scanned the document in shock. A son? This couldn't be happening. Her father had a child, another child, and her name wasn't even on this letter. The child's name, however, was Thomas Cole. Caroline's hands shook as she read the name over and over. Thomas Cole. Could it be? Was he Sarah's son? Was this the truth my father had hidden from me all these years? She felt her stomach drop, the weight of the discovery settling in. That night after dinner, Caroline decided to meet Thomas. The lawyer had arranged it, and Caroline's heart was racing as she stood outside the cafe where they were supposed to meet. She had so many questions. Why hadn't he reached out? Why hadn't my father ever told me about him? When Thomas walked in, Caroline barely recognized him at first. He was tall, with short, neatly combed dark hair and a suit that fit him perfectly. He had the same eyes as her father, but there was something different about him. He wasn't exactly what Caroline had imagined. The resemblance was undeniable, but Thomas was a stranger to her. He walked over to the table and sat down across from Caroline, his expression guarded but curious. "Caroline?" Thomas asked, his voice low but steady. Caroline nodded, still unsure of what to say. "I don't know how to begin. I found the letter. I found the pictures. I need to know about you, about our father." Thomas looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of emotion, sadness, guilt, and something else that Caroline couldn't quite place. "I understand," he said, his voice soft. "I've always known about you, Caroline. I knew you existed. But our father never told you about me. He didn't want you to know." Caroline's heart raced as the words sank in. Why? Why would he keep something like that from me? Why didn't he tell me about you? Thomas sighed and looked down at his hands, folding them on the table. "He loved you, Caroline, but he made a mistake and he knew it would hurt you. It's not an excuse, but he kept me a secret because he thought it would be easier that way." "Easier for who?" Caroline whispered. "For him, for all of us." Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline's world had shifted on its axis. She couldn't understand how her father had kept something so huge from her. How could he hide a whole brother from her? They were family, and family didn't hide secrets. But her father had, and now Caroline was left to process the weight of this truth. Over the next few days, Caroline spent hours talking to Thomas, learning about his life. Thomas had grown up in a different town, raised by Sarah, and had never met Caroline until now. Their father had visited him once when Thomas was young, but it had been a secret visit, hidden from Caroline and everyone else. Thomas told Caroline that he had always wondered why his father kept his distance, but now he understood. But Caroline was still struggling to reconcile the past with the present. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father's choice to keep Thomas a secret was a betrayal. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a strange connection to this man who was her brother. Despite the pain, despite the confusion, Caroline was starting to understand that family wasn't always about the perfect picture. It was about love, and sometimes love had its own complicated path. Caroline had always believed that family was everything. But as she stood in front of the mirror, looking at herself and her new brother, she realized that sometimes the things that break us are the very things that can make us whole again.